Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's April 4th, 2026. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. Today's topic is IQ. This is a topic that IQ is something we're both interested in. Ness has a lot more knowledge about it than me. The direct catalyst for this episode was a solo episode Ness did recently on the Iraq conflict, and he mentioned in a somewhat offhand manner that Iran has an IQ of around 90.
The figure I gave came from Richard Lynn's book, Intelligence and the Wealth of Nations, and it puts Iran in the low 80s.
Okay, well, I read an article today that estimated anywhere from 90 to 104, so who knows what the most accurate number is. And another important thing to point out is that Iran is about 60% Persian, and our guess is that the Iranian Persian IQ average is higher than the non-Persian Iranian population, and it appears that the Persians are the ones in almost all of the positions of influence and power in the country. So in the context of the war, the Persian IQ is probably more relevant than the overall Iranian IQ. But regardless, that just got me kind of thinking about IQ.
Well, in most places, the ruling population, the elites, are going to have a higher average IQ than the broader population. So I don't know that a lot of the dysfunction that I attributed to Iran, in particular vis-a-vis its military capabilities, from not just the consanguinity, the inbreeding, but also the theocracy and the economic sanctions and the international isolation. Those things come together for a confluence of factors that presumably would cause problems for Iran's ability to execute militarily against the United States and against Israel. But just because the intelligence of the leadership is high doesn't mean that if the mean IQ of the country as a whole is going to be, that higher IQ of the leadership is going to negate that. I would imagine even in countries like Nigeria, where the measured average IQ from the same book, The Intelligence and the Wealth of Nations, comes in the low 70s, I suspect that the leadership is probably triple-digit IQ on average. There is a broad appendix in the back of the Intelligence and the Wealth of Nations book. We haven't done the requisite homework to look at the direct sources, the primary sources for those IQ estimates, but that is generally regarded as one of the gold standards for estimates, at least so far as they exist. The Greg Johnson article that Jeff is referring to has an unsighted estimate ranging from 90 on the low end to 104 on the high end. That is a very broad range. The normal distribution of a Northwestern European population for IQ is 100 with a standard deviation of 15 points. So that's almost an entire standard deviation. Just the range of that estimate for the average IQ, it's the difference between the average intelligence of a Black American and a white American as measured by IQ. If Iran's average IQ was in the 3-digit figure range, then it would put it with Northwestern European countries, East Asian countries, and European diaspora countries like Canada and the United States. I don't think that the performance on most of the metrics that correlate at the national level with IQ, that really corresponds to where Iran is, although as a counterexample, the presumed measured IQ of North Koreans would probably be triple digits as well. And so there is a lot that international sanction and bad government can do to hamper countries. So it is possible that the Iranian IQ is that high, although I have to say that I am skeptical, and I think that Richard Lynn is probably closer to the mark.
IQ is definitely a very relevant metric when evaluating a conflict like this, but it's something that you'll never hear mentioned in any sort of remotely mainstream media source. And that gets to part of the taboo nature of IQ. Let's start with some background. So in the early 1900s, the French government made primary school education compulsory, and they had an immediate practical problem. They had to be able to identify children who needed extra instructional support. So a French psychologist named Alfred Binet and his colleague Theodore Simon were tasked with developing a systematic tool for this purpose, and they came up with something that became known as the Binet-Simon scale, and it was published in 1905. And it's the first the first iteration of what we now call IQ tests. Then in 1916, an American at Stanford named Louis Terman adapted the scale for American use, and it became known as the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale. And like many, perhaps even most of the intellectuals of that time period, early to mid 20th century, Terman was an enthusiastic eugenicist. The U.S. Army in the lead up to World War I developed an aptitude test, and it was administered to about 2 million men. And in a foreshadow of the many controversies to follow, there were significant variation in score by origin, country of origin, and race. This data helped, at least in part, shape the rationale for the Immigration Act of 1924, which curtailed immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Which is interesting because the 1924 Immigration Act put absolutely no restrictions on immigration from Latin America. I'm not well versed enough in the history of IQ testing prior to the second half of the 20th century to know why that was the case. Probably because it was predominantly something that was done in Western European and diaspora countries, and so there just wasn't information available for Central and South America. But that is something that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, that the very restrictionist Immigration Act of 1924 that severely limited inflows of people into the United States from all over the world from 1924 until 1965 had no provisions for Mexican or Central or South American immigration. And it wasn't just because there was no movement of people during that time. In fact, having lived as a kid in Texas, I can recall that there, and still today, you can see a lot of this celebration of sixth and seventh and eighth generation Mexicans by ancestry who are Texan and proudly Texan, who have been in the country longer than a lot of Irish and Italian and German descended Americans. Presumably the predominant reason that there were no restrictions are the same reasons that there is so much seemingly incorrigible resistance to immigration enforcement against immigration from Mexico, Central and South America today, and that is because that labor is useful for agricultural interests.
And that era, early 20th century, was the golden age, so to speak, for eugenics and race science in a lot of ways. There were authors like Madison Grant who helped bring attention to anthropology and racial differences in IQ, and bringing up the perceived threat to the Anglo heritage stock of America, the threat that mass immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe was posing to the traditional American racial stock. And race and IQ intersects also with the theory of evolution, which of course was originally conceived by people like Charles Darwin and continued to gain acceptance by the population up through the end of the 19th into the 20th century. And a flashpoint in that debate of creationism versus evolution was the 1925 Scopes trial, which we have covered on a previous episode. But briefly stated, it was a court case brought by the state of Tennessee against a school teacher So the school teacher knowingly violated Tennessee state law prohibiting the teaching of evolution in school. He purposefully, I believe there was if I recall correctly, there was sort of an activist spin behind it. He knowingly violated the law in order to bring the case and to bring attention to the matter. But he was teaching out of a textbook, which I believe also endorsed the idea of eugenics, but he used the textbook to teach about creationism. So William Jennings Bryan was the creationist who prosecuted the case, and then the school teacher was represented by Clarence Darrow, who was a very popular, well-known defense attorney at that time. And so Darrow took the secular evolutionist side of the debate. So Darrow represented what we would recognize and what was recognized at the time as the progressive, more left-wing perspective, which was pro-eugenics and believed in evolution and believed that there were fundamental innate biological differences between races and many traits, including intelligence. Whereas today in 2026, the most vehement opposition to the idea of there being biological differences between races, and let alone there being innate differences in intelligence between races, leftists, secular leftists specifically, would oppose that idea the most vehemently. On the other hand, my guess is that among conservative Christians, there would be less hostility to at least the discussion that there are major differences between races and that perhaps there are even significant differences in intelligence and innate ability between the races.
The quip about the past being a foreign country is very germane here. There are a few interesting things to bring up apropos this discussion. The idea, one that I am as susceptible as anyone else. I am as guilty or more guilty than the next person in terms of cynically thinking that the ratchet always turns to the left and progressivism always gets what it wants eventually, but that is not the case, or at least it doesn't appear to be the case for some of the biggest progressive causes of the 20th century. Prohibition is one that went down in infamy, and eugenics another one. These were leading progressive causes of the time that are now somehow retconned into being associated with the right. There really is a myth of the 20th century aspect going on with this period of progressive dominance in politics prior to the Second World War, where the way that it's characterized now is that the I freaking love science types who were on the right side of history in the Scopes Monkey trial, that they are the enlightened ones, and yet they will attribute to the hidebound, retrograde, putative religious conservatives this lingering desire for things like eugenics and obsession with IQ differences. And yet the landmark case of the 20th century having to do with this battle between evolution and creationism, one that is taught in public schools still today in the 21st century, was one that pitted a right-wing creationist anti-eugenic movement against a progressive left-wing, very scientifically underscored support for eugenics. And while I won't quibble too much with the characterization of it being a full 180, I think there are aspects of eugenics that are still supported by progressives today. Really, it's the allergy in particular to the idea that there are group differences that are meaningful that causes the problem. It's not eugenics so much per se. It is, in fact, a celebratory talking point. You'll hear from progressive types how in places like Scandinavia, effectively Down syndrome has been completely eliminated, and that is, of course, through eugenics. The General Social Survey has a question specifically where it asks respondents if they would support aborting a baby because it has genetic defects. From the general social survey to the question, suppose a test shows your baby has a serious genetic defect. Would you yourself or your partner, would you want them to have an abortion if a test shows that the baby has a serious genetic defect? So this is not just a question about the idea of abortion in the abstract. This is specifically asking about a scenario where the respondent or the respondent's wife or girlfriend is pregnant and a genetic test reveals that there's some sort of serious genetic abnormality. Would you want an abortion to be performed? Yes or no? For those who self-identify as politically liberal, 55% say they would want the abortion. For those who identify as moderate, 44%. And for those who identify as politically conservative, just 35%. And I don't know what a more explicit illustration of what eugenics is than aborting specifically because there is a genetic defect. I know the same Latin root word is in both of those terms for a reason. There is no better illustration of eugenics in practice, and yet here leftists are twice as likely as those on the right to want to have an abortion performed. And the 180 might end up being a 360 down the line. This is an idea we've tossed around previously, but if we get to some CRISPR 2.0 level technology that permits easy genetic in utero modifications, or even prior to implantation of the egg in the uterus, for genetic edits to be made, and there is the scientific capacity for genetic problems to be ameliorated prior to birth, effectively for fetuses to be genetically edited to have more eugenic outcomes upon birth, I can certainly see a social landscape where that becomes a position that is associated with the left, because it provides the opportunity for the socialistic or communistic ideal to be realized, to really create something close to an even starting point, an even set of conditions for people coming out of the womb. And another aspect, although it has not muted, but the tenor has been turned down on the left in the Western world, the association with Darwin, the idea of Darwin as being this heroic figure, this enlightenment figure that has pushed the world out of the hidebound dark ages, that has mitigated somewhat, but it hasn't disappeared entirely. And it's interesting that Darwin, of course, who was the cousin of Francis Galton, who is known as the father of eugenics, that Darwin himself understood the implications of his theory would mean that there would be differences in all kinds of traits for humans, and cognitive traits, the brain being the most energy intensive, complex organ in the body, that far from somehow being exempt from evolutionary processes, that in fact the evolutionary processes would most acutely affect and influence outcomes in brain differences and differences in cognitive capacities, behavior, personality traits, the whole set of factors that make humans what they are. On the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Another interesting consequence of this subject is that for at least the last 50 years, the correlation between intelligence and fertility has been inversely correlated. That is, the idea that intelligence is somehow a benefit in terms of evolutionary fitness, while that was likely the case through much of human history over time, especially in the case of men, that has been not just negated over the last 50 years, but in fact reversed with the onset of widespread contraceptives, the pill in particular, but also widespread access to abortion, condoms, and other methods of separating fornication from procreation has had the effect of in Darwinian terms, making high intelligence, and this is particularly acute for women, the correlation between intelligence and fertility for men is almost flat. There is a very slight inverse correlation, but the correlation is almost literally an order of magnitude more pronounced among women, where the less intelligent a woman is, the more children she tends to have. And so the weird manifestation of that confluence of factors and modern technologies is that people who are most likely to express belief in natural selection and the secular evolutionary explanation for life on Earth, the Darwinists, are the least likely to have Darwinian evolutionary success, while those who most stridently express their opposition to Darwinism and the idea of evolution and instead go for a creationist, religious, supernatural explanation for life are the ones who are the most successful from a secular evolutionary perspective.
It's kind of a weird split between the beliefs. I would say the right, broadly defined, inherited some aspects of Darwinism while the left inherited other aspects. So I suspect the left would be more likely to agree with Darwin in the sense of believing that humans descended from primates, but the left would recoil at the idea that that the splits among groups of human populations, that the differences between those groups that split off are significant and innate, while the right would, again, the more conservative Christian side of the right would believe in creationism and disbelieve in evolution, but they would be more likely to recognize that there are differences between races.
I think even the most strident leftist will still grant that there are innate differences that are evolutionarily influenced, but the emphasis needs to be on the other word that you use there, which is significant. They will say that all of the differences, because of course there are manifest differences in terms of skin tone and some physiognomic characteristics like epicanthic eye folds for East Asians, larger lips for people of sub-Saharan African descent, different hair textures by populations, but they hand-wave these things away as all being totally trivial and superficial. And so they'll say, yes, there are some very superficial differences that have to do with different evolutionary tracks. I don't think we're to the point where someone would say that there are actual schools of thought, such as they are on the left, that would say something like skin tone is a social construct. But I think it's just about universally understood that there is a genetic component to things like that.
And this gets at the cognitive dissonance that results from trying to hold all of these contradictory ideas in one's head at the same time. The idea of believing in Darwinism and holding him up as an intellectual hero, but essentially repudiating key components of Darwinism. And funny enough, it probably helps to have a relatively high IQ to be able to navigate these landmines, because anytime you talk about a lot of these topics, you have to be very careful. And if you are too loose in following a rational train of thought, you can easily end up in bad think and violate some taboo.
Yes, this is another thing the General Social Survey bears out. There is a question about nature versus nurture, effectively, and the less intelligent a person is as measured by word sum, which is a quick and dirty vocabulary test that, funny enough, correlates positively at 0.71 with IQ, which is almost as high as the correlation between IQ and college entrance exams like the ACT and the SAT, that the less intelligent a person is, the more likely they are to attribute differences to genetic reasons, while the more intelligent a person is, the more likely they are to attribute differences to purely cultural and environmental reasons that have nothing to do with genetics.
Getting back to some of the background on IQ tests, in 1939, David Wexler published the Wexler-Bellevue Intelligence Scale at Bellevue Hospital in New York. And previous tests produced a single number, but Wexler's divided it into two components, a verbal scale and a performance scale, producing both an overall score and a cognitive profile. So even today in 2026, the most commonly administered IQ test is a variation of this Wexler test, which was developed in 1939.
Are we sure that's the most commonly administered test in the United States? I have to imagine that it's the Wonderlic test. The Wonderlic test is a 50-question test that only lasts for 12 minutes that, to the extent that it can get around concerns about Griggs versus Duke Power, the 1971 landmark Supreme Court decision that effectively outlawed aptitudinal tests if they couldn't be tied directly to job performance, to the extent that companies and organizations, institutions are able to get around that, they use the Wonderlic test. Whereas the Wechsler IQ test is an administrative clinical exam that takes a lot more time, a lot more administrative setup, and it has to be administered, I think, by people who are trained professionals in interpreting the results.
Yeah, when I said the Wexler test was the most commonly administered IQ test, I was thinking more a formalized clinical setting versus Wonderlic is more of a quick and dirty test. That's not to discount its importance. It correlates quite closely with IQ, but it's not quite something that you would use. Like, for instance, if you were testing a kid for the gifted program, I would guess you would use something like the Wexler test rather than a Wonderlic test.
Yes, that checks out. Just having looked it up now, Wonderlic assesses over 4 million candidates a year. This makes it far more widely administered in terms of sheer volume than the Wechsler test. And that makes sense given its purpose, because it's a 12-minute, often pre-employment screening test rather than a technical, clinical, cognitive assessment. So it is sort of a semantic issue there, where while Wonderlic correlates with other IQ tests around like 0.90, very high correlation. And that's probably about as high a correlation as a Wechsler test given on a Monday and then given on a Friday, because there is some variation here. Your own IQ test, even if you take the same test a week later, is not going to correlate perfectly. So the Wonderlic effectively is very close to a reliable proxy of IQ, but in the technical sense, it is not actually an IQ test.
So let's now try to get into what IQ actually measures. What's the point of IQ, of measuring somebody's supposed IQ? What does it tell you about the world? What does it tell you about that individual person? So a child who does well on vocabulary tests, for instance, tends to also do well on arithmetic, pattern recognition, spatial reasoning. And this observation led to the concept of G intelligence, or general intelligence. And someone high in G tends to perform better than average across virtually all cognitive domains, and then vice versa, someone low in G tends to struggle across the board.
Yes, this in the literature is referred to as the G factor.
So needless to say, G is not a thing in the brain that can be pointed to. It's a statistical construct, and it's an inference from patterns of performance. But regardless of how one feels about the whole idea of putting a numeric value on something as complex as intelligence, there is no doubt that G correlates very well with academic achievement, job performance across many different occupations, not just the high cognitively demanding jobs. There is a quite high IQ, I think even professions that one doesn't think require a high degree of cognitive ability, not to be insulting, but something like a janitor, there actually is strong evidence that having a high IQ makes you a better janitor, for instance.
Yes, Charles Murray famously has said, and he's someone who has studied IQ, the IQ literature and research for decades, has said that the only instance he has ever come across where job performance has been inversely correlated with intelligence was tomato peeling. Or maybe it was potato peeling. It was definitely one of those two things. The thought being that some tasks are so repetitive, so menial, so mind-numbing that with any sort of internal dialogue possible in a person, that is going to detract from the ability to continuously perform the task without having one's mind drift such that you end up cutting yourself. But for other menial tasks, virtually for everyone ever measured, with that one odd exception, even the most degrading work known to man, like janitorial work.
All right, Mr. Smartenheimer, that does it. First, you're going to give back everything you've stolen. Then I'm sentencing you to 1 week of the lowest, most degrading work known to man. Janitorial work.
I'm standing right here, sir.
Ah, yes. Take a good look at it, Nelson, because that's where you're headed.
But even menial, repetitive tasks with very low barrier to entry that don't require a lot of training to master, those still correlate positively with intelligence. There are decisions to be made about how to utilize time, how to utilize various chemicals, when to make judgment calls on whether or not something needs to be cleaned or some issue needs to be reported. There are a whole bunch of mundane decisions that over the course of a day and a week, a year, and a career add up to a significant difference in outcomes and output.
I'm reminded of Flowers for Algernon, which was published in the late 50s as a short story and then as a full novel in the mid 60s. And in that novel, the main character, Charlie, is mentally retarded, and he undergoes an experimental procedure, and eventually his IQ increases, and he becomes highly intelligent, and then tragically his IQ goes back down towards the end of the novel. But at the beginning, at the very beginning of the novel, he's a janitor, and he's not great. He has a good attitude, and he's good-natured, but he doesn't do a very good job, and he's made fun of by his coworkers. But as soon as he gets the procedure that increases his intelligence, he starts excelling at the job and starts to leave behind his coworkers and do much better than them, and they start resenting him. So this idea was apparently understood even before Charles Murray articulated it. This idea that IQ correlates with doing a good job even in jobs that are not cognitively demanding. And also in that novel, Flowers for Algernon, in a lot of ways, Charlie becomes less happy and less satisfied with his life as his IQ goes up. And I'm reminded again of The Simpsons when there's an episode. Homer's obviously known for being a buffoon and obviously low IQ, but there's an episode where it's discovered that he has had a crayon jammed in his brain since he was a child, and that accounts for his low intelligence. And Dr. Hibbert, when he took the x-ray, he was always covering up the crayon in Homer's brain. And so Homer undergoes a procedure and has the crayon removed, and his IQ goes up to, I think, like low 100s. So he's like around the average, but his quality of life takes a nosedive, and he becomes a much less happy person. And he has a more kind of a touching heart to heart with Lisa because he starts being able to relate to her, but he eventually decides to have the crayon rammed back up into his nose so he can go back to his blissful ignorance.
That episode is, in fact, the inspiration drawn from it is credited to Flowers for Algernon, and there is no reason not to double dip to put a primary source to give words to what Jeff was referring to.
Being a brain has alienated me from all my friends.
Dad, as intelligence goes up, happiness often goes down. In fact, I made a graph. I make a lot of graphs.
And while that's a nice sentiment so far as it goes, and there may be some truth to it across groups, between different groups, that is to say that groups that tend to have a lower measured average intelligence, like sub-Saharan Africans, also tend to report higher levels of self-reported happiness than do East Asians or Northwestern Europeans. That does not hold within populations. There is a modest but positive correlation between intelligence and self-reported happiness. Now, that is probably attributable to the consequences of higher intelligence that more strongly correlate with self-reported happiness, things like marital stability and socioeconomic status and health outcomes. So it may not be intelligence per se that correlates positively with intelligence, but it does need to be stated that Lisa is incorrect there empirically.
Another aspect of G's usefulness is its supposed stability, meaning that whether you take it when you're 10 years old or 50 years old, whether you take it once or twice or 3 times, the score you get is going to be pretty similar each time. If you can train and coach and get coached and improve on your IQ, then the whole premise of IQ being something that measures innate ability is undermined.
I think this is a good point for a little digression to turn over in our minds what exactly intelligence is. And it is especially relevant now as we record this in the midst, or what seem to be the seminal stages of what looks to be a pretty revolutionary effect on humanity that AI promises. And yet we distinguish between AI as artificial intelligence and what is called AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. And the latter is closer to what we're really getting at when we talk about IQ, because we get down to it, something like AI is just effectively taking a bunch of information that's already there and putting it together. You'll hear this in the intelligence research referred to as crystallized intelligence as opposed to fluid intelligence. And crystallized intelligence is effectively just facts, just things that are known, that are learned, that can be studied for effectively. While fluid intelligence, which is what the G factor is getting at, is something that cannot be trained for. Although that needs a little bit of a caveat, you can definitely do things to reduce your G factor, to reduce your IQ. There are ways definitely to inhibit one's own IQ. To use the famous Gregory Cochran example, you can hit people over the head with a ball-peen hammer. You could do things like consume paint with lead in it. You could asphyxiate yourself for a few minutes. You could suffer a stroke. There are a whole bunch of deleterious effects that can cause IQ to drop, but there is virtually no evidence of what can be done in terms of intervention to raise IQ tests or IQ scores, including preparing for intelligence tests. That doesn't alter outcomes in any significant sense at all. And so there is a question now if AI is really intelligence in that G factor sense, or if it is just crystallized knowledge. It is the ability to flip through the archives at lightning speed, but the ability to synthesize information isn't actually present with the current iterations of AI. And so by that rendering of what intelligence is, AI really doesn't have an IQ score per se.
As we alluded to earlier with the Wonderlic test, there are other aptitude tests that correlate more or less with IQ tests. So things that most, at least up until recently, most American high school students took, either the SAT or the ACT. There's a pretty strong correlation. I think it's roughly 0.7 to 0.8 overlap between SAT, ACT, and the IQ test. And that correlation also applies to tests like the LSAT and to a slightly lesser degree, the MCAT. And so if we accept something like G factor measures innate intelligence that is static throughout one's lifetime, then the tests that you can study for less, meaning by studying for it, you're not going to increase your score very much. The more that's the case, the closer those are to IQ tests. And anecdotally, something like the ACT can be studied for, and your score can be raised significantly by study and practice, whereas the LSAT is studying for it is not likely to raise your score as much.
Before we move on, I'm going to do the but actually thing, a little bit of an addendum to what Jeff said. While prepubescent, adolescent, childhood IQ correlates pretty well with adult IQ, it is far from a perfect correlation. It depends on what age the initial intelligence test is administered, the earlier it's given, the less it tends to correlate with adult IQ. The estimate puts it between 0.5 and 0.8 correlation at ages 8 to 10, which is kind of a middle ground of childhood. We get a measured correlation with adult IQ at 0.70, which is about the same as the correlation between adult IQ and the word sum 10-question vocabulary test. Correlations, briefly for a little statistical interlude here. Correlation, also known as the correlation coefficient, which is measured in a lowercase r in statistical jargon, that measures how related two things are to one another. And if you take that r value and square it, you effectively get how much of a certain outcome can be attributed directly to the other outcome, the other dependent variable that you're looking at. So in the case of a correlation of 0.7, we square that and we get a correlation of 0.49. What that effectively tells us is about 49% of the score, the IQ score that an adult receives, will be able to be determined by the score that same person received when they took the test at age 8, 9, or 10. So what that residual 51% or so in this particular case is hinting at is what we would in colloquial terms refer to as nurture. And so when people are prepubescent in childhood, there does really seem to be something like a 50-50 split between nature and nurture. But over time, especially once the brain is fully developed in the mid-20s, and as you move into adulthood, the importance of nurture falls away and nature comes to predominate. And a perfect example of this phenomenon in action is the Head Start program. I'd let Jeff give some details on that.
Yeah, so Head Start consistently produces IQ gains of several points in early childhood, but then by the time the kid gets into around 3rd or 4th grade, the gains will have largely disappeared, and then by adolescence, they are essentially gone. And this fade-out pattern has been replicated across multiple programs in multiple countries. So if you take an IQ test at age 25, it's not going to be, then you take it again at age 50. In most cases, it's not going to be significantly different between the two. But if you took an IQ test at 10 years old and then you took it at 30, it could be significantly different. Ness alluded to the eternal debate between nature and nurture, how much of a person's capacity and achievement is attributable to their innate ability versus how much is attributed to their childhood, the environment they were raised in.
And substantially on the nurture side of things, their peer group, to the extent that it's been measured. What nurture is distinct from nature is that it is largely affected not so much by the parental environment, but by the peer group more than anyone else that has influence either positively or negatively.
I would argue essential to IQ being something relevant and something that we should care about is that it measures something that is stable and innate and that can't be significantly changed by interventions. What pushed me firmly to the nature side having more of an impact on IQ than the nurture side was learning about twin studies and adoption studies. And so with twin studies, tests have consistently shown that there is far more similar IQ test scores between identical twins than there are between fraternal twins, even when they're raised apart. And then with children that are adopted, again, once they reach adulthood, their IQ is far closer to their biological parents than their adoptive parents, which if you were on the pro-nurture side or the side that thinks nurture has more of an impact, then you would think that the adopted child's IQ intelligence would be closer to their adoptive parents, but that's not the case.
Yes, it's especially not the case once they reach adulthood. Now, while they live in the family of their adoptive parents, the scores, though they don't correlate anything close to perfect correlation. They do correlate more strongly with their adopted siblings when they're younger, prepubescent, while they live in the adopted family's home. But as they reach full physical and brain maturity, that correlation doesn't just dissipate, but almost vanishes entirely. But in bringing up the nature versus nurture debate, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the Flynn Effect, which is the observed tendency, especially in the second half of the 20th century, for IQ test averages to increase across developed countries throughout the world, such that for several decades from the 1950s on until the 1990s, those 4 or 5 decades, the IQ tests often had to be renormed because the averages for white populations that the IQ test is designed to have as a mean average score of 100 were coming in the triple digits, going up to 104, 105, 108. And so they had to be renormed back to 100. Speaking about the Flynn effect will seem like a bit of a relic from a generation ago, because it was noticed already in the late 90s that the Flynn effect seemed to be dissipating. And now, to the extent that it still exists, it seems to exist in the inverse, where the scores of these populations that had been increasing, seeming to experience a secular increase over time, are now beginning to experience a decrease in the average. The reasons for the Flynn effect are not agreed upon in the literature, and I certainly won't have the audacity to try to settle the debate here, but I do think that, apropos what was mentioned earlier about how IQ scores can be lowered, while they can't be boosted, they can be held down from their natural expression where they would get to if not for deleterious environmental effects. And so I think the Flynn effect, such that it has been observed, is a consequence of things like lead being removed from paint and cleaner drinking water, better antibiotics, a lot of the things that, if they didn't kill people, would severely debilitate them in the past. A lot of those things have been ameliorated such that they don't cause the same kind of problems that they have historically. And so there has been some gains that have come out of that, but there is a limit to how much populations are able to gain once they get to an acceptable floor of living conditions where additional betterments of the environment doesn't translate into higher intelligence.
Yeah, in the decades following the Second World War, a lot of the low-hanging fruit issues were addressed. But once the basics like nutrition and sanitation are taken care of, you get into diminishing returns in terms of environmental interventions that you can perform to have meaningful effects on IQ. So now we get to the most controversial aspect of IQ, and we've alluded to it a bit before, but now we'll address it a little more head on. That is racial differences in IQ.
Controversial in the cultural and political senses of the word, but not controversial at all in the empirical sense of the word. The data is as clear on the racial differences in intelligence as it is on any other aspect of intelligence. And IQ, more than any other measure in the social sciences, has a remarkably reliable, consistent, replicable history over the 130 years that it's been studied.
Yes, there are arguments as to whether IQ is a accurate reflection of what we mean when we colloquially say intelligence. But there is, as Ness said, no doubt that IQ, as quantified by tests, specific tests such as Wonderlic or the Weskel test, there are significant, repeated, clear differences in average IQ between the major racial subgroups of Homo sapiens. So in the United States, for instance, the average gap between black and white Americans has been documented consistently since the Army Alpha tests that we mentioned, which were administered in the World War I era. And this gap is approximately 15 points, with black Americans averaging around 85 and white Americans around 100. And then East Asians, which are mostly consist of Han Chinese, Japanese, and Korean people, the average is around 105 to 108. And then Ashkenazi Jews have the highest average IQ of any ethnic or racial group in the world, with estimates ranging from 110 to 115. And then the sub-Saharan African data produce averages around 70. And so again, you can attack the validity of IQ tests, but it's impossible to argue that these gaps in IQ scores exist. And that, of course, has led to a lot of debate over what is the reason for these significant gaps in IQ between racial groups. And again, it gets back to the nature versus nurture issue. The most compelling argument I've heard on trying to explain why there are these differences is the sort of sun people versus ice people theory, which I've heard articulated in different ways, but it's basically that in sub-Saharan Africa, the physical environment was such that it was relatively easy to survive and achieve the necessary conditions to survival and to reproduction, so that the environment did not place tremendous amounts of cognitive strain on the populations relative to other environments such as cold, harsh, difficult environments where survival was dependent upon more long-term thinking and complex interactions with the environment, and creating sophisticated long-term planning where you had to make sure that you hunted and prepared enough in the summer and spring months to make it through the harsh winter months. And so there was more planning required.
And to the response, well, the Inuits don't test particularly high in IQ, nor do the Anu people in Japan or the Sami people in Scandinavia. Why are their IQ scores not in the triple digits? They have existed for centuries in these especially harsh climates. And that is, the theory goes, in part due to the fact that there is also a social aspect here, that when society gets sufficiently complex, as it grows large enough to support status, hierarchical differences, and specialization in economic production, when societies move from tribalistic herders or hunters and gatherers to those living in more complex, socially stratified societies, that puts an additional artificial, human created, societally created pressure on intelligence to be able to navigate the complex web of human interactions that peoples that exist in harsh climates but at very low numbers, that never developed that level of social interaction and social complexity, their populations were never selected for higher intelligence in the same way that settled larger civilizations. And so while the Sami and the Inuit and the Anu people have higher measured intelligence than sub-Saharan Africans, they tend to be lower than those of other East Asian or Northwestern European populations.
Yes, that's an important addendum to add to that ice people, sun people theory. It is certainly not bulletproof. The existence of these gaps in IQ is far more certain than the explanation for why these gaps exist. It's hard to disentangle these racial differences in IQ from the concept of eugenics. And I came across an interesting quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a influential African-American intellectual. in the early 20th century. He was a Harvard doctorate and a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And he actually engaged with population-level cognitive variation within the Black community in pretty explicitly eugenic terms. In 1932, he was writing in the journal called the Birth Control Review, and he stated that, quote, "The mass of ignorant Negroes still breed carelessly and disastrously, so that the increase among Negroes, even more than the increase among whites, is from that part of the population least intelligent and fit, and least able to rear their children properly."
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable given how far back in time that occurred, because the General Social Survey today, the latest data today, shows that the dysgenic trend is far more pronounced today among blacks than it is among whites. So turning to the General Social Survey again, breaking populations out into quintiles by intelligence, the real dumbs, pretty dumbs, normals, pretty smarts, and really smarts. Roughly 20% of the population falling into each of those categories. For whites, the real dumbs category, that is the bottom 20% of people in intelligence is measured by word sum. Among whites, they average 2.4 children over a lifetime. Compare that to the most intelligent quintile of whites, they average 2.0 children over a lifetime. So it's a difference of 0.4 children over a lifetime. And that pattern is a consistent one. As we move from lower intelligence to higher intelligence, fertility drops again from 2.4 at the lowest end of intelligence to 2.0 at the highest end of intelligence for whites. Well, the same directional pattern exists for blacks, but the difference in fertility is way more pronounced. Among the lowest quintile of intelligence for blacks, the average total lifetime fertility is 3.0. Among the highest 20% of intelligence among blacks, the lifetime fertility is just 1.1. So the dumbest black people have on average 3 children, while the smartest black people just have 1. Compare that again to the dumbest white people having 2.4 kids and the smartest white people having 2.0. And we see that a century later, W.D. Du Bois' observation remains as true, if not more true now than it was when he made it.
As far as I know, Du Bois is still in good standing among the progressive left. So I'd be curious to see if they're aware of this quote, and if they are aware, how they've reckoned with it. Because it's not really much different than what you might hear a hardcore white nationalist say in 2026. And speaking of another person who traditionally is championed by the progressive left, Margaret Sanger, she actually picked up on this Du Bois quote and reprinted it in the 1939 Birth Control and the Negro report. And so it's just yet again an illustration of how many of these concepts we've been talking about, from eugenics to IQ to evolution to birth control, all being firmly associated in the early 20th century almost exclusively with the progressive left. Another figure who would fit in comfortably with Margaret Sanger and Du Bois on this point would be the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who in the 1920 case, Buck versus Bell, famously said, quote, "3 generations of imbeciles is enough," in his justification for basically giving the green light to forcibly sterilizing a mentally retarded woman so that her bad genes could no longer be perpetuated.
It might be a little overstated to go back to what you mentioned a couple minutes ago about the view being simpatico with that of a hardcore white nationalist. But if we give that hardcore white nationalist a magnanimous heart, we can definitely see that if this topic wasn't so mired in artificial controversy, that real gains could be achieved. Going back to the population examples Jeff had mentioned previously, in the United States, whites And in Western European countries, the white score is around 100 on IQ. In the United States, blacks average an IQ of 85, and sub-Saharan African countries come in the low 70s, around 70 on average. Well, blacks in the United States are on average about 20% European by ancestry, and they are 80% sub-Saharan African by ancestry. And so if IQ was entirely genetic, then we would expect if the sub-Saharan African IQ is 70 and the white IQ is 100, that blacks in the United States would have IQ averages around 76 or 77. But the black IQ average is significantly higher than that at 85. And that suggests that there is a big environmental advantage in the United States compared to sub-Saharan Africa. So whatever that is, whether it be a lack of iodine in the diet or bad drinking water or childhood diseases, whatever those environmental deleterious effects, those Greg Cochran ball peen hammer effects are, if they could be reduced or ameliorated completely in sub-Saharan Africa, the average IQ in sub-Saharan Africa would likely increase. If we just take a rough genetic estimate again, with blacks in America at 85 and whites at 100, sub-Saharan Africans at 70, we could estimate that we could get sub-Saharan African IQs with Western levels of societal advancements in medicine and technology up to the low 80s. And though the low 80s is still not 100, still far below that of white Americans, and that's the problem for the equalists, is that even though treating this subject clinically and in a mature fashion could lead to real world benefits, the taboo around it is such that we can't achieve those gains. And yes, of course, low 80s is not 100. And so that's the problem. If you point this out, even if you can make things better for sub-Saharan Africans, you're still giving truth, you're giving veritas to the idea that there are differences in IQs between groups, and that is offensive to our secular ideology or secular religion. And so we can't have that be acknowledged, even if the real world consequences would be moving a population from an average IQ of 70 up into the low 80s, which that's almost a 15-point increase, which would map on to the difference between social outcomes of blacks in the United States and whites in the United States.
There is arguably no greater taboo than the racial difference in IQ. And this is the reality taboo, so this topic is tailor-made for us. And Ness got to something I wanted to make sure we close on is I've heard this in my own life when IQ is brought up, and specifically the racial differences. The response oftentimes is, well, even if that were true, what's the point? Why are you focused on it? What difference does it make, even if it were true? And I think that's an important question, and I think there are answers to it. For one thing, there would be an acceptance of significant cognitive abilities between different groups and different individuals, and there would be an acceptance of this, and that would lead to not trying to constantly intervene and create unreasonable expectations and unfairly blame teachers for being unable to close the racial gap between their students. And there are other implications, things that would hopefully flow from a reasonable, sober assessment of the reality of these racial differences, but perhaps we can get into that in later episodes.
And it would hardly be all upside for people of higher intelligence. As we alluded to earlier, people who are more intelligent, who do better on IQ tests, are the least likely to say, at least publicly, that IQ tests measure anything important. And that's not totally coincidental. There's an obvious self-serving bias at work there, because if IQ is like height or athleticism or introversion or agreeableness or some other personality trait that you get rather than earn. Well, if you have a higher IQ, then it's a variation of the with great power comes great responsibility. Like, you should succeed. You should not be able to make the same excuses that someone with a lower IQ has. And so you achieve something in your life. Well, that's not really that impressive if you have an IQ of 120. You should be doing more. So this is another avenue where I think there could be another 180 where progressives take up the mantle of IQ validity, because you could also see where you had you could implement a progressive tax regiment based on IQ, or a whole slew of other social benefits. You could set up a situation where institutional entry is effectively handicapped by higher intelligence. So if you have higher IQ, well, then you have more to work with at the beginning. And so to rectify that, we're going to acknowledge that. And then to rectify it, we're going to give benefits to people with lower IQ because they have less to work with. There is a plausible world where IQ privilege gets wrapped up in the DEI conception of things alongside other things like white privilege and male privilege and all these other putative privileges. But in the case of IQ, we really would be measuring perhaps the most important privilege in developed modern Western societies. And if you're someone who has climbed up the social status ladder in this society on account of a high intelligence that you didn't do anything to earn, well, it sure feels a lot better and makes you look a lot more impressive if everybody believes you got there because you just worked really, really hard, really diligently, and made a bunch of sacrifices. And so paradoxically, we have a system now where the higher your IQ is, the more you benefit from pretending that IQ doesn't mean anything. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.